Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Scott Hinkle. I'm the director of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, and it is my great joy to welcome you to what will be our last Think and Drink conversation of the semester. In just a minute, I will introduce our moderator tonight, Ken Giroux, but a couple of quick notes. If you wish to ask a question to our panelists, you can do so in a couple of ways. Down here in your screen, there will be a box for Q&A. And if you choose that and follow it, you can send a comment or a question directly to our panelists, and only the people on the panel will see it. Or you could also come down here and click on the chat button, and you can choose to send a note either just to the panelists or to everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I want to say one quick note before I introduce Ken Giroux, and that's to say that Ken Giroux is an excellent human being. He and Frederick Douglass Dixon have run the Humanities Institute's Think and Drink programs during these plague times, which have been not fun for anyone, frankly. But they've done a really great job, and I deeply appreciate the work that they've done creating some community and some interesting and sometimes hard and important conversations during a period when the world is really difficult to be in. So I deeply appreciate their work, and with that, I will turn it over to Ken Giroux, who will moderate our conversation this evening and introduce our panelists.
Oh my, thank you, Scott. That was very kind. So tonight, we're going to have a conversation that can be interesting in a number of dimensions because of parallels and divergences in circumstances. Our two panelists, Anne McCutchan and Leslie Brody, have both recently published biographies. Leslie's was in December, so essentially just a few months ago, and Anne's launch day was Tuesday, so that qualifies as recent also. So two women biographers who have written biographies of women authors, and in both those cases, one unintentionally, a book that they're most well known for is apparently become appealing to children. I say that Marjorie Rawlings' book, The Yearling, wasn't intended to be. It's not a children's book, but lots of people, when I mentioned that book to them, remember it. Oh yeah, my grade 4 teacher read that to me or something. So it's a coming of age story that somehow appealed to, at least to people who teach children, and became something of interest to children. So there's the parallels, but they also had very strong differences in terms of the material they had to work with, the challenges they had to meet in order to get to the story. As Anne has instructed me, there's the story, which is the circumstances. And if I were to write my biography, I can be sure that you would get my birth date would be correct every year in that biography. And after that, it would become vastly less interesting. There's the things that are underneath that make the story come to life. And that's true for both of the subjects of both of these biographies. And I hope that we hear some more about that. But why don't we start with Leslie, her book, if you want to hold it up momentarily. I'll just give them both a chance to do that. Sometimes You Have to Lie, The Life and Times of Louise Fitzhugh. Louise wrote the book Harriet the Spy. There's the allusion to Sometimes You Have to Lie. And Louise was a difficult person to write a biography about, I understand, because there's not that much there, written material, sources, resources. It required some serious detective work or maybe spy work on Leslie's part to find out about that, and we'll hear about that. Anne's book, hold it up, Ms. McCutchan, is about Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, and the title of that is The Life She Wished to Live, a biography of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. And the title reference, The Life She Wished to Live, isn't a reference to something that didn't happen. It's in fact the efforts that Marjorie went to create and live the life she wished to live. She got the life she wished to live to a large extent. So maybe one of you can start, and then you can bounce off each other. I'm really interested to hear where you saw in this process of researching these two women, their lives, where you saw opportunities and where you saw challenges. Maybe let's start with what drew you to that person as a subject for a biography in the first place? Maybe Leslie can start there, and then I'll just sit back and admire the conversation.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. Um, okay, so the reason I first got involved with Louise Fitzhugh was because I was a playwright and I was living in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis in the late 80s. And I was working, I began working for the Children's Theater there, and I was commissioned to write an adaptation of Harriet the Spy. I will go ahead and tell you that I am exactly the same age as Harriet the Spy. So in 1964, when Harriet, the character, was 11, so was I. So when I was 11, I wasn't reading books about 11-year-olds. I was reading books about Michelangelo and, you know, Leonardo da Vinci. I was like obsessed with Florence and you know, I wanted big books. I wasn't reading about girls my age, and I was so wrong. I was so glad to have the opportunity to be introduced to Louise Fitzhugh and Harriet the Spy. And once I met them, I never wanted to let go. So I'm talking about a period of about 20 years when I was the idea was kind of percolating as I started to write biographies of others. I first wrote a memoir called Red Star Sister, and then I wrote a biography about Jessica Mitford, which was my practice biography. And I got that one, you know, I made all the mistakes I could make in that one. And it managed to still get itself published, and some people read it, and that was wonderful. But then I was ready to really start something different, and that was The Life and Times of Louise Fitzhugh. So I'll just drop it there and let Anne take over tell us how she came to start her biography.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. Well, I grew up in Florida, which is a sort of baseline for me. And when I was in fourth grade, my fourth grade teacher read the Yearling to the class. And every day after lunch, she would read a chapter, a part of a chapter. And so that was my introduction to Rawlings. It was lovely. It was a lovely reading. Some years passed, many years passed. I left Florida. I too had a practice biography. It was a biography of Marcel Moyse, the French flutist. It was my first book. I went back to Marjorie when I was writing a memoir about Florida, about growing up in Florida, and read Cross Creek, her sort of mixed memoir type book of the place she lived in Florida. And I just fell in love with the language, just again, the lyrical sentences. I was a musician first before I did this. And so the sound of the sentences, the vocabulary, was just wonderful. Then a couple of years went by, and I'll tell the short version of this story. A friend who was the head of a foundation in Dallas came to me and said, I think that there should be a biography of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, and you're the one to write it. And it was magic. Yes, of course, I would love to do that. And I've been reading her. And so she offered some financial support to do it, or for much of the research. That's how I came to it. It was as if my friend Joanne Bartlett she was a matchmaker. She saw the subject, she saw me, and she put us together, and that's how it happened.
Great story.
Yeah, it was a great story. Very happy, grateful.
So Leslie, despite the fact that Marjorie lived 100 years ago, essentially, she died in what, 1950 or something?
1953, Marjorie.
Yeah, and Louise was much more of a contemporary person. My understanding from what I know, from what I've read so far, is that you had quite a more challenging job finding out about your subject. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So Louise was born in 1928 to a very wealthy family in Memphis, and they were, the more you look into them, the more Gothic they appear. There was an opera singing grandmother who used to throw money outside, and somebody outside would catch it in a basket. There was a crazy uncle up in the attic cutting up dolls, who was also a poet and had I can't remember what it's called when you can't stop talking. There's
An academic? Are you looking for?
there's a condition. Anyway, he had that in terms of writing poetry, could not stop writing poetry. And he was very proud of it. It flowed, he said. Anyway, so she had quite a distinct family background that was she felt repressed by, in any case. She started dating women in high school, and she had love affairs with men and women all her life, but it was very clear to her that she was a lesbian and that she had to get out of Memphis. That was just like, let's just do this. And she ended up at Bard College in New York. So I say this as prologue because in the mid 20th century, being out and being an author of any kind, but especially being a children's author, it was not something that you publicized because people feared that it would depress your sales, right? So her friends protected her. So there weren't a lot of there's no archive to start with. Okay, so there's no Louise Fitzhugh archive. And then the interviews that occurred, say pre-1980, always protected Louise, and people would not talk about her as a queer person or as out. They always protected a kind of mythology of who she was, a kind of a spinster lady with a very good sense of humor. When she was just a wild mind, really. Okay, so just to shorten it a little bit, there were, after 1980, there were a couple of books that came out. Well, first there was a book, a kind of a short academic study that kind of told some background of Louise. The author was named Virginia L. Wolfe, and she did lots and lots of she had exchanges with Louise's friends, and some of them weren't willing to be forthcoming yet. Some of them were. And then there was a Village Voice article in the 90s that really broke everything open. That was by Karen Cook. And she's been incredibly, the journalist, now a psychoanalyst, Karen Cook, was very kind and allowed me to have access to her notes. Okay, so just to end that, because there's so much here, we can unpack it a little bit later. It was very hard initially to get people to talk about Louise. It was very hard because there's no footprint, there's no tape of Louise speaking, there's no film that was accessible that anybody would show about Louise, and her estate was not want to maintain her privacy. So that was the framework within which I had to do my detective work.
So did you study Harriet the Spy to get some techniques and tools for this operation?
Absolutely. Everything's in there.
Yeah. And your situation was quite different, despite the greater length of time between your subject being here with us and you're studying her. Tell us about that.
Well, Marjorie, her life spanned 1896 to 1953. And so when I started on this project, there were perhaps 6 or 7 people living who had known her as children. And most of them are gone now. I can't think of anyone right now, but I interviewed several. Interviews couldn't be at the heart of my research at all. What I did have to work with was the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings archive at the University of Florida. And as the archivist told me when I first started the project, it's one-stop shopping here. And it almost was. It was 95% was. There were more than 4,000 letters there to and from Marjorie. There were all of her manuscripts, her drafts, her notes, field notes from research. She little reporter notebooks, photographs, other kinds of things, documents, interviews with other people about her, typed interviews from earlier days. So I had a lot on paper to work with. Part of the amount was due to, back then there were no phones. Where she lived, there were no telephones in the middle of Florida. So she wrote an awful lot of letters, and she was also separated by choice from her second husband. A lot of time, they worked 70 miles apart, and so they wrote letters constantly to each other, and when he was in the war. So there's a huge trove of letters between her and her second husband, and her first as well. It took a long time to get through. At first I thought I can read these chunks, but I probably don't have to look at these other ones. But in the end, I looked at everything, and I have a copy of everything here, either on my laptop or in a box somewhere. I also went, since I've been friends with some very important people like Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, people like that, Zora Neale Hurston. There was correspondence. I went to other archives outside Florida, University of Georgia, South Carolina, I can't name them all, and asked if there were letters from Marjorie to some of these people, so I could get additional letters that were not in the archive. And I did come up with some, which were very, very nice. And there was one point where I found a treasure trove of letters in the hands of a used book salesman in South Carolina. These letters were up for sale by the owner, and I was allowed to sit in the book salesman's living room and read all the letters, and I could take notes, but I couldn't make copies. So I was doing some interesting detective work myself.
Yeah. I was just going to say that Louise didn't like to write letters. So that was another issue. There weren't those, she kept some sketchbooks, but the only extensive letter exchange was with James Merrill, who started out as her advisor at Bard and became her lifelong friend, the poet James Merrill, and also Lorraine Hansberry. They had a very intense, short but intense letter writing exchange. And then there was also the issue that, her estate said she wants to be private, and that's really true. She was a very private person. She was very shy, and she was insulated with, she had a trust fund early on, and then she made a lot of money from her book. And so she decided she didn't need to play the marketing publicity game, and she didn't go out and do interviews, and Louise didn't go read at bookstores. She wasn't prepared to change her clothes for anyone. And she looked, she wore jeans and sweatshirts, and in the late 1960s, early 70s, that was not how you toured with a book. And she said, well, I'm not, I'm just going to be me. And she was.
Marjorie had to go on a few book tours. She became a public figure, especially after the Yearling won the Pulitzer. Mm-hmm. And so she was, a lot of her gigs were with women's clubs. Back at the, not bookstores per se, but women's clubs and universities. And in this very deep correspondence that goes on for 17 years between her and her editor, who was Maxwell Perkins, the famous editor of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and so forth. And in the letters back and forth, she's complaining. She's like, I'm not going to give up my writing time to go here and there. And, you know, a lecture agency, a big rep wanted to put her on tour, and she would not do it. She did do some, you know, visits, but not big tours. And Max protected her. He said, "You're right. You should not. Don't do this. Go start your next book." You know, so the whole issue of once she became a public figure, if you will, well known, of protecting the private life and the writing time was tough, ongoing issue.
Yeah.
So that's something those two subjects had in common,
Mhm.
actually, that they're, and now I suppose it's going to happen to the two of you now that these books are out. Your public life is just going to like, nope, sorry, can't do that.
I don't know about that, but I think it's funny that Louise Fitzhugh also had worked with a genius editor. She worked with Ursula Nordstrom, who was at Harper and Row, and who nurtured many great children's authors, Maurice Sendak, and you know, just God, the list. Little House on the Prairie, and I'm just thinking of all the books that that were, you know, she brought in the authors, and she kind of created this stable of magnificent writers who have influenced the 20th century, and you know, and us to this day. Ursula really wanted Louise to go out and sell the book. And she knew that very often children's authors were underestimated. And sometimes you had to just present yourself and show the world who you were and the value of your work. And Louise was always painting as well as writing. And as a painter, she wasn't going to leave her easel. She just wasn't going to leave work in the middle. And so that also contributed both to her lack of engagement with the world, but also it started to cause friction between her and Ursula eventually. And Louise went to a different publisher for her last book.
I wanted to, you reminded me of that. Go to the idea, the issue of women and money, which you and I have talked about, our two subjects. Louise had a trust fund, right? And Marjorie did not. She was a freelance writer, just, you know, hitting the streets in New York and doing what gigs she could get until she inherited money from when her mother died. And with that money, she bought sight unseen an orange grove in Central Florida. She'd had one visit to the Cross Creek area, and decided, okay, send some money down to her two brothers-in-law who scouted out a piece of land for her with an orange grove on it, and she and her husband just went. She couldn't have made that jump without that money. And when she got to the orange grove, it turned out it needed a lot more work than was thought, and so it was very hard for several years, hard labor. But then once the Yearling sold, she was independent.
Yeah. I mean, it's stunning to me that her persistence and her dedication and her conviction through the whole time. You know, I think that was, Louise also had a will of iron, although she did a couple of books with Sandra Scott Batone. She did a book called Suzuki Bean, which was a novelty book, which is the kind of takeoff of the Eloise books. Suzuki Bean was based in Greenwich Village, and as opposed to being in the fancy plaza. And then she did another book with Sandra called Bang Bang You're Dead, which was an anti-Vietnam War book. And, you know, I think both of these, her friend Sandra talked about how she was difficult to get along with, how she had so much charisma. People adored her, but she was not an easy person to be friends with. However, she's incredibly generous, and she had this passion for so many different things, for singing, for musical instruments, for her animals, for writing, for painting. But she, it was just not easy to be her. And yet she also had that will that I'm thinking about with Marjorie, that maybe is what a genius woman has to have, a woman genius, however you want to say it, that just somehow, whatever it takes, I'm going to get there. And even though Sandra said she never worked, which was funny because Louise made everything look kind of easy, her illustrations, the fact that she could just sit down and write, even though she didn't have, she had to discipline herself, but it wasn't the way it was for some other people. It just really flowed when she wanted it to. She undermined herself a lot. She drank a lot.
Well, so did Marjorie.
Yes. That was the other side of the conviction, really.
It really is. Marjorie was driven. She was very hard on herself. She revised constantly. She was always breaking up her sentences, putting them back together, and doing a lot of hard work on the sentence level with these big books. And she was fragile.
Yeah.
She had health problems starting in high school, and then when the Roaring 20s came, or really college during World War I, she started drinking, and she never really stopped. She'd be quit for 2 weeks and then back with a bottle of Bacardi or whatever it was she was drinking.
Rum? Was that her primary drink?
Actually, that and whiskey and moonshine.
Oh my God. Yeah, Louise was a brandy person, and I don't know why, but that was what she drank. Yeah.
Well, there were moonshiners in her little corner of Florida where she moved, and so she'd get some hooch, when she needed it, and store it up. So she undermined her health that way, not just by driving herself, which any of us can do, but the drinking too, and rich food. She was very proud of her cooking. She loved to cook. She did write a cookbook and used the richest materials. She had a cow, and I'm sure it was a delight to be at one of her dinner parties. Anyhow, yeah.
Louise loved to eat too, and she loved sweets, and she loved to have her steak dinners, and she liked to go out on the town in New York and have a very fancy meal at a very fancy restaurant from time to time. And if I may, I just feel like I let down Ursula Nordstrom. I'm just going to read a couple of the people who she nurtured. Okay, sure. So including Margaret Wise Brown, who wrote Goodnight Moon, and E.B. White, author of Charlotte's Web, Laura Ingalls Wilder. I can't believe I forgot the author, Little House on the Prairie. Okay, all right. Charlotte's Web, let's see, Little House on the Prairie, Curious George, and then the illustrators Mark Simon, Garth Williams, etc. I mean, she just
classics. They're all classics.
Brought all these people together, and she understood that she felt that there was a glass ceiling, and she couldn't really. She wasn't going to rise in that publishing house. And so what she did instead was just make this majestic domain where everything was brilliant and everybody worked and all the books won awards, except for, I have to say, Harriet the Spy never really won an award. And that was really interesting, that just to see how it just was too defiant. It wasn't going to be rewarded for the kind of child, that kind of anti-authoritarian kid who Harriet was. Nobody was going to shower prizes on that. But anyway, it's still with us, right? That's what matters.
That's a remarkable collection of authors that that Louise was part of.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would have loved, you said you would have loved to have been at a dinner party that Margie held. Ursula Nordstrom had a Christmas party every year through the 60s. And I just remember, I imagine this is like something out of the New Yorker cartoons of the 1960s, where these, everybody's smoking and all the men are in, tight black suits with hair hanging in front, and the women have these buffet hairdos, and, there's canapes, and it's like, everybody's listening to Miles Davis. I just wanted to be there. That was one of the scenes that I just, I wish I could have been there, and I wish I could have written it more. You know what I mean? It's like, sometimes, did you find that too? You'd start a scene and you have to keep to the truth, right? You
Yes.
have to tell what happened as opposed to how you imagine it to be, unless you go off on this digression and say, I imagine it. And then everybody tells you, well, why are you imagining it? Let us imagine it. So,
This is a biography.
but I really wanted to, I wanted to write a short story about it, and I didn't, but I there's so many parts in the book that in my book that I think would make a lovely, story, play, something. If anybody, come on over, you can use it if you want to expand it. Because I just think, I'd love to see, for example, the very beginning of the book takes place before Louise is born, as her two parents, who are like out of the jazz age, are divorcing, and it's a gigantically it's just a sensational divorce, and her father has family money and power, and he's a lawyer. Her mother is a dancing teacher from Mississippi, and gets a kind of bad rap as the woman, on the other side of the river. And the father's family just crushed the mother's family in the divorce. And in fact, Louise was told for 5 years that her mother had died. And I'm just going to say that I was so fortunate. I was working with the most incredible researcher, whose name is Regina White. If anybody is looking for a great researcher, she found the transcripts to the trial, 1,000 pages. So when you were saying you were telling yourself you'd read some of it, but not all of it, that's how I felt about those transcripts. But eventually I had to read all the transcripts to write the beginning of the book about the trial. But that trial would make such a great movie if anybody's listening, interested.
I know the temptation to run across material in a story and want to embroider it, or we just have one more scene that I get to make up and imagine that it is so tempting. But what makes it compelling, right? These women's stories, they touch our imaginations, and we want to write more.
Well, those crossovers, like those people who you were talking about, her friendships, Robert Frost, right? I mean, that blew my mind when I read that, right? I mean, and I'd love to hear you talk more about that. I was just going to say that when Louise was on the same boat as, oh golly, I forgot, or I have to come back to it when I think about it. But she was, her life crossed with so many other, writers, and she knew Juna Barnes, and there were just tons of people who crossed over that would have made fantastic stories themselves. But you have to keep to the central story, or else your book's going to be 1 billion pages long, right?
That's right. With Marjorie, especially after her first novel, South Moon Under, was published in 1933, and it was highly praised. It got wonderful reviews. It was considered for a Pulitzer, and that put her on the map. And in that time, it was early 30s. There were a lot of writers, well-known writers, who came to Florida for the winter, and they would come down on the train, stop at Jacksonville, go on down to St. Augustine. Some went further down to Miami, like Frost did. Wallace Stevens, the Benet family had roots in St. Augustine. So these people sought her out. She made rich literary connections sitting right there in the middle of an orange grove. But that continued then. She traveled north more and more as she, went to New York to consult with Max Perkins or see good friends. She was very close with her publisher's daughter, Julia Scribner, who was about
Right.
20 years younger. And she would often go up in her rounds in the Northeast, spend time with Julia Scribner. So these friendships she had those friendships, and she also had her friendships in the hamlet of Cross Creek, the cracker folk, if you will. The white families who raised their own food, their own livestock. She was part of that community too. It took a while for her to be accepted there because she was seen as a sort of highfalutin lady who just, dropped herself down there. But she was generous, like Louise, very generous with her resources and her time. She did have hired help. She had, at least half of her hired help was Black. The Black families lived in the same area. She had conventional views of race at the time, which were changed when she met Zora Neale Hurston.
Yeah.
And that was, as I've said, a come to Jesus moment when she realized here was an equal, an intellectual equal, a writer, as fine a writer as she was, and she went, whoa, and her relationship to her neighbors and her staff changed after that. So now I'm rambling, but
Yeah,
but it's all about friendships and relationships.
Absolutely. I mean, I just wanted to say a couple of things because I know the time is short, but first of all, can't believe I'm just like nervous at the moment, and like I'm on TV, so I forgot the name of Hannah Arendt. I ought to be,
Oh, okay.
it's like how I could forget the name Hannah Arendt is like astounding, but never mind, I did. But now I've restored my myself. So I wanted to just say the other thing about friendships, that Louise in her prime was part of this incredible society of high-flying lesbians in New York City who did all these jobs that but they weren't out in the way we think now, right? But they had their world, and in their world they were casting directors, they were agents, they were Broadway publicists, Broadway angels, they were in theater and art, and they were like this incredible, they were this world unto themselves that were just so creative and so active and making so much and giving each other so much reinforcement. And they lived on the Upper East Side, and they lived in the Hamptons in the summer. And it was really this fascinating society that I don't think enough people have heard about, and I hope they'll read a little bit about it in my book. And I just wanted to say a little bit more about Louise. Also came of age in a Jim Crow environment, of course, but because she, even though she had the money and the background and the family and was the confidence, she felt, that she had to get the heck out of there. She already knew she would be marginalized, and she identified with marginalized people, and that's what we would say now. And she just abhorred Jim Crow. She said, bury me north of the Mason-Dixon line. I never wanted, she did have to go back a couple of times, but that was her central theme. She repudiated, she called Memphis a cesspool. I'm sorry to my friends in Tennessee, but she identified what it was and said, that's not for me. And that's not going to be part of my life. And in fact, she, in all her work, there is a commitment to civil rights.
Yeah.
A couple of things. One is a question or a request from Janice Harris, a longtime, now retired University of Wyoming colleague, friend of Anne's as well and mine. I want to hear more about those aspects of the writing that are tempting, that you had to hold yourself back on. So that's one thing. And the second one, Leslie, you mentioned something a few minutes ago that made me realize that if I were to go write a biography, I would be doing a whole lot of work, I suppose. But you both have made allusions to the fact that in some way or another, the work you did was part of a team. You had people working with you or for you, perhaps. And I think that would be useful for anybody. I mean, anybody in the audience who's thinking of writing a biography of me, for example, they might need it. No, I'm just, the team part of it was perhaps not something that an innocent would have imagined. So maybe talk about that, and then also the strategy, the bad strategy of following your temptations when you're writing, and how you have to edit yourself out of that. But I'd like to hear about the teamwork part.
I can jump in with that. When I first went to the University of Florida and to look at the archives, I was introduced to Florence Turcotte, who was the head archivist for the Rawlings papers, and she told me where to start. She told me, here's what's most important. Here will be the groundwork, and she became almost like a sister over the 6 years I was working on the book. I could call her anytime. So because I never lived in Gainesville. I would go there for a week to 3 weeks at a time to do research, but then I would go back to where I was living and work. And I could call her anytime, ask her questions. How important is this person to her life? Should I read these letters first?
Okay.
And then as I've been there several times, I realized I needed someone I could call who would go make copies of things for me. So Flo Turcotte's daughter, Celine, who was an undergraduate at the University of Florida at the time, became my research assistant there. I did have money to cover that sort of thing, to pay Celine, for example, and to travel. And that was great. Celine was between Flo and Celine. I called us Team Marjorie there in Smathers Library. But other than in addition to that, there were two places I hired research assistants outside of Florida. One was Louisville, where I just did not have time to go there and spend a week, and I didn't think there was a lot there. I did hire a graduate student, a student of one of my friends at the University of Louisville, to go into some archives and make copies. And then I spent a week in Rochester, New York, unearthing Marjorie's old journalism and microfilms and that sort of thing. And when I got to the end of the week, I realized I hadn't finished. So I hired a graduate student of a colleague of mine in Rochester who finished the job. There were many more people I spoke to on the phone who were the son of somebody or the granddaughter of somebody who knew about so-and-so's relationship to Marjorie. My list of acknowledgements is just so darn long. So yes, I did the work of contacting these people, but these people gave me so much in return. And in some cases, somebody might meet me at, say, a historic place where Marjorie had been and talk with me about her. So it was wonderful. As you know, I'm a musician as well, and so the social opportunities in writing a book are valuable, as well as those opportunities to be in a room by yourself and write and think. So.
Yeah. I mean, I already mentioned Regina. I mean, she's just a brilliant researcher. I did the footwork and the interviews, but, you know, Regina helped find people who'd been lost forever, or who hadn't wished to talk in the past to anybody. She was, you know, just a genius at, you know, finding things that I could then follow up on. I also hired fact checkers to, you know, towards the end, I only had 4 years to write my book. So it turned out it's very expensive to write a biography. You either have time or money. And so I hired people to help me do the, the fact checking and to do some other research things. And then there's all the librarians, and it was just, you never write a book like a history or a biography alone. You
No.
really you stand on others' shoulders, and then you just have a huge group of people who help. And then I just wanted to say about inserting myself into the book. I Because of the situation with the estate, and because they were reluctant I just have to keep saying they wanted Louise's privacy to be maintained, and I so I had to get the story from her friends, and then I had to put it in my own words. So it's really a very different kind of storytelling, without depending on Louise's own quotes, without depending on her many quotes from. I had to limit how much I could use from the books. And so I wrote it several times until I could actually tell it in my words. And once I wanted to tell it in my words, I wanted to really tell more than there was. I wanted to speculate. I wanted to be there. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to write another biography like this. I want to be in the biography from now on. I want to write a different kind of biography. And there are examples out there. I just don't know if that's if I'd succeed, but I feel that is the temptation to say to Janice. That's my temptation to go all the way.
That's interesting. I've not felt that, but I felt so so close to my subject. That is, she was someone I thoroughly delighted in getting to know and spending all those years with her. That's another thing about writing a biography. Once you commit, you can spend years with that person in a way. They're always with you. And I liked Marjorie, and I liked her drive, and everything about her. She was a very salty tongue. She cursed like a sailor. She was just she could be prim and proper when she needed to be, but I just loved the many aspects of her. And so it's a pleasure. I didn't want to be in the biography, but I wanted to go to her dinner parties. And I wanted to talk books with her, because one thing that was in those letters, she had several correspondents with whom she exchanged ideas about what she was reading. And they would, Max Perkins sent her new releases all the time. And so did a book executive, Norman Berg, who's a very close friend of hers, sent her books. And they would have these wonderful exchanges about what they read. And it came to a point where, when I first turned in my manuscript, my editor came back and said, "It's just great, except the last 5 chapters need a little more focus." And I went back and I realized what I'd done. I'd had too many exchanges about books, because I was so fascinated with what they were reading. It was like overloaded with these things. I thought, no, we can't do that. Only the books that refer to maybe what she's writing or what's in the air at this moment that has to do with social issues she's confronting, that sort of thing. They had to be relevant to the story.
I'm dying to ask you before. I know that again, we're going to run out of time, but we haven't at all talked about what the editing process was like for you, and what it was like to work with. I don't know who your editor was, and if you'd known them before, or
my chief editor-in-chief was Jill Bielowski, who's a vice poet and vice president at Norton. But the woman I dealt with really now, Jill is the one who came back to me and said those last 5 chapters need more focus. She read the first draft I turned in, but then after that it was a young woman named Drew Whiteman, who was fabulous. Once I had revised those last 5 chapters, it was just accepted as is, but it went to a copy editor who was also a fact checker. So
Yeah, that's what's going on now. Yeah.
yeah, and it took her some weeks, and I got it back. I couldn't believe how thorough the facts, the fact checking was so helpful. And after that was done, then of course the end notes and permissions to quote, that took about a year to get all that settled. But the editing process itself was pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I had two fabulous editors. I mean, I started off with Laura Mazer at Seal Press, who acquired the book and was really the genius behind it. And so much she encouraged me to write it, and we really started this book together. And about, let's see, just as I finished the first draft, Laura moved from being an editor at Seal Press to being an agent, and is now my agent. But and I was assigned a new editor, and I was so lucky because this editor is fabulous. A very young woman named Claire Potter, who's brilliant. So I mean, it's funny, all the things that I said to myself going into the project were, I mean, I don't know how faithful I was to them, but I said, I'm going to go with this ride. It's happened more easily than other books because of the love that's out there for Harriet the Spy. But also because there were so many people who loved Harriet the Spy, the chances were that, I would tread on them as I wrote about Louise Fitzhugh, right? That they would have these ideas about who she was. But I decided that I was just going to try and not complain. That was like that was my mantra. And it was really hard because I do, I'm of a little bit of a complaining nature. And it was like, I had to really beat that back. And it was like, I'm going to go for this ride and I'm going to just see where it takes me. And I'm going to meet my deadlines, and I'm not going to complain. And it made it a better experience. This is a job. I love this job. I'm going to do it.
One thing I just thought of and recognized, and maybe we've spoken of this before, but our subjects, each of our subjects lived in places we know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So we know the physical territory
Yeah.
mostly, which is helpful and probably helped attract us to our subjects.
Yeah, so much. So I lived on the other side of the tracks from Louise on Long Island. She would summer in the Hamptons or in Quogue, and my family lived in Riverhead or in Spionk. Those are the two kind of other side of the Hamptons where the other people lived. But I just had the idea of where she went swimming and the kinds of houses she lived in. And then of course she lived on the Upper East Side, and I'm from the Bronx, and again, very different, but it's still, being a kid going on the subway, it's the same sensation, right? And growing up at that time in New York, where you could travel wherever you wanted. I mean, that's one of the issues that I hear from parents now. This kid just goes everywhere. This kid's out in danger. This kid's, climbing into dumbwaiters and going, breaking and entering. And it's like, I didn't do that, but I'm like you had the freedom of the streets, and your parents weren't really frightened for you, I'd say, when I was growing up in the 60s.
Right. And I was growing up in the 60s in Central Florida, in a town, not in the hammock or the scrub, where the kind of place where Marjorie, catapulted herself. But let's face it, I skipped school. I drove the back roads. I forged notes. It can be told now. I forged my father saying I was sick when I was just out in the orange grove somewhere in his Ford, So I know that the backwoods of Central Florida, we had orange trees in our backyard. and St. Augustine, I knew pretty well. We would go up there. It was about an hour and a half from where we lived. So that part of Florida and its history and just the terrain, which was so much a part of Marjorie's books, the wetlands, the hammock, the pine forests, so familiar. I'm sitting right here with pines behind me in a painting. They're so
Nice, yeah.
lovely. So yeah.
I have orange trees in my backyard.
You're in California.
I will bring them when we go to have our drink together someday.
So how important do you think that geography part is? I mean, I would imagine if I wanted to write a biography of somebody from the past, was that part of the draw to your subject? That I mean, for example, if Louise had lived in Philadelphia, Leslie, it might not have been as, it wouldn't have been the same thing, or the same thing with you, Anne. The fact that you both, not necessarily specifically really tightly, but you're both generally grew up in and were familiar with the geography. And somehow that strikes me as being really important to be able to get inside that person's head a little bit and I imagine their lives. I thought.
If I could just, what's so interesting to me about Louise is she, when she first came to New York, well, she was in Bard, and then she went and moved into Greenwich Village and then uptown. But she was desperate to get rid of her Southern accent. Again, sorry to my friends in this house. She just wanted to, just jettison it. And she took on a Brooklyn accent. So she spoke with a Brooklyn accent for a little while. She also totally used as many Yiddishisms as she possibly could. This was like the 1960s in New York. And I just think that's hilarious. Of course, one of her longtime partners, Alex Gordon, was Jewish. And and it was just in the, the atmosphere that somebody would be a schmuck or a schmo, or, in her book, she talks about plotzing, and, it's just a fantastic way of, it was her way of moving away from Memphis and becoming a full-on total New Yorker. And as she aged, she started to integrate more of Southernisms into her books. And the illustrations were strangely, when you would see something and it's supposed to be New York or Long Island, but it doesn't look like that at all. And, if you really investigate, you see it's someplace in Tennessee or something. So
with Marjorie, her serious writing started when she left the Northeast and went to Florida. She was born in Washington, D.C., and her parents are from the Midwest. But all of her great writing, except for the last novel, were written out of that Florida environment. And that's a character in all Florida novels, is the environment, the hammock, the scrub, the alligators, the crabs. And so it's very important to those books, and of course attractive to me. And I know that those places or places like them, but her writing in that environment were tied closely together, and part of it had to do with her fascination since college days with the idea of cosmic consciousness.
Right, there you go.
Newton, Whitman, and so forth, and to the end of her life, she wanted to express the way everything was connected, nature, weather, people, not only how we were all connected, all living things are connected, but that we are all affected by these connections, and in some cases we don't have control over them. Anyhow, that's
and Louise in Harriet the Spy has her nanny Ogali talking about Dostoevsky and reading Dostoevsky, and this concept of love everywhere and how we have to love everything. And it really is a connection there that I hadn't actually thought about. But it is a Dostoevsky and kind of cosmic love philosophy.
Yeah. So more than a children's book for you and me. They had bigger things they were saying as well.
Yeah.
This has been a really interesting conversation. I think we've touched on lots of dimensions of the task you both took on, you each took on, I should say, in writing your biographies. Is there anything that maybe we haven't touched on that you might either or both of you want to address as we wrap up? I think we covered a lot of ground, and it was very interesting just to sit back and listen to you two chat about it. Lovely, actually.
Are there any questions in the chat that we haven't answered? Anything that we could close with?
I'm curious to know, are people here who are familiar with Harriet the Spy and the Yearling? If those are the things that attracted you to the books, or anyway, I'd love to hear from people who are here, but oh, there's a Q&A. There's somebody in questions now.
So as somebody who's encouraged as a writer on a biography, encouraged by your stories and help, that's beautiful.
That's wonderful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Great projects, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll just say I'll thank you both once again. And if Scott can get out of his muscle shirt and back into his street clothes, he can reappear and we can close the recording.